This is Digging Deeper with At the Coalface, and this week's episode is thanks to Coal Australia, a not-for-profit membership organisation representing the people and companies committed to building a secure future for Australian coal. Sign up to be part of the community at coalaustralia.com. And here's your host, Jessica Rouse.
Chris Uhlmann, who must say I've followed as a journalist for a very, very long time. He's freelance these days with The Australian and with Sky. He presented at the Asia Pacific Carbon Connect conference that I was at in March, and it was just such a great presentation and something that I wish everybody could have seen about the importance of coal for our energy security and coal in general, and the really simple fact that it is quite essential. And he joins us on this episode of Digging Deeper. Chris, thank you for joining us.
No worries, Jess.
Now, you used a great, I'll call it an analogy at the conference, starting your presentation with your grandfather and the fact that fossil fuels have been around for forever and a day.
Yeah, look, the way that I try to explain it to people is, and to get them to understand where their wealth came from, is that my grandfather was born in 1899 on the outskirts of Brisbane into a house that had no electricity and no gas. There were lamps for light. The wood was burned in the stove for heat and for cooking, and there were no cars on the streets. There were no planes in the sky. There was an outdoor toilet. And when he died in 1967, we were 2 years away from the moonshot. He had a suburban house with a Zephyr Ford in the garage. He was very proud of that. You know, he had an indoor toilet. He had a television set. He had a telephone, all of the mod cons, right? Electricity inside the house. And how do you imagine we got there? Well, that was all fossil fuel. We'd seen the beginnings of it in the burning of coal through the Industrial Revolution, which drove the big engines, burned the coal, made the steam, turned the wheels, and eventually we moved the wheels across the landscape in trains and across the seas in steamships. But it was when we really got to oil, when oil became the foundation, if you like, of the modern world, that we saw this massive leap forward in human history. We've never experienced anything like it before that, and we'll never experience anything like it again. Like, forget the smartphone and AI and everything else. The biggest progress we ever saw in human history in terms of wealth, lifestyles, human health, all happened because of the power density of oil, coal and gas.
Do you think people realise the very basic fact that, as you say, coal changed everything? Fossil fuels, we need it for food. We need it for so many things. Without it, what are we left with?
I think the majority of Australians have absolutely no idea where their sources of energy, their sources of food, or their sources of wealth come from. They flick a switch and the light comes on. They go down to the shops, there's food on the shelves. They don't think about where that food comes from. They don't understand the fact that if it wasn't for a process using gas, that we would not be able to create the synthetic fertilizer that we need to feed half of the world's population. The Green Revolution was based, whether people like it or not, on fossil fuels, on the Haber-Bosch process, where we got nitrogen from the atmosphere to feed plants. So genuinely, if you're having a salad, even if you're feeling pretty pure about the way that you go about eating your food, if synthetic fertilizer was used in the making of it, you are literally eating fossil fuel. And most of our power generation still comes from coal, and we're seeing that as each one of those shuts down, as we try to transition to less dense forms of energy, we are making sacrifices because of that. And one of the sacrifices is it costs more. There are many other sacrifices, but the simple fact of the matter is the world still runs on coal, oil and gas. That's where we get more than 80% of the world's primary energy, the energy needed to do all things, and 91% of Australia's energy.
And demand for coal is huge. The International Energy Agency in 2024, it was at a record high. China burns 58% of the world's coal. The demand outside of this country is massive.
Yeah, and you just put your finger on one of the things, and one of the great fallacies we get about the energy transition. Last year, the world burned more coal, oil and gas in a single year than ever before in human history. Now, there's no dispute about that. So there's not an energy transition. We are using more sources of wind, solar and batteries to try and get more electricity generated by that source. but it's an energy addition. It's not an energy transition. The world is using more of everything, and no better example than the one you just gave of China. People keep talking about the amount of wind, the amount of solar, the amount of batteries that China's putting in, yeah, and the amount of hydro, but also the amount of coal and the amount of gas and the amount of oil, because China is doing more of everything. And is it any wonder to you, by the way, Jess, so when we talk about fossil fuels being the source of wealth, how did China get wealthy? How did China go through the course of my lifetime? It went from being one of the poorer nations per capita on earth to one of the richer nations on earth. What did it do? It burned fossil fuel. As the West gave up on manufacturing, it took up manufacturing. How did it do that? Well, it powered the way it's always been powered. And now it's not just economically powerful, it's militarily powerful. Literally, coal, oil, and gas deliver societies economic and military might.
You mentioned solar, wind, batteries. What are your thoughts on those renewable energies?
I think we should do everything we can to use as much of every energy source that we can that makes sense. So I would have an all of the above approach to energy. I think that there is a place for solar, absolutely, in Australia. We have lots of solar resources. We've got lots of rooftop solar going in at the moment. I think there's less of a place for wind. I think that that'll get to be a stranded technology over time, because why? We have to spread it across massive landscapes to get anything like the amount of generation that we need to replace the generation that we're getting rid of. I mean, and I don't have the exact figures in front of me at the moment, but if people keep talking about this is a 100 megawatt wind farm or a 200 megawatt wind farm, well, only if the wind's blowing. So
That's
across
right.
the course of a year, you'll get 40% of that. So in fact, you should always say this is generation capacity, not actually generation. Wind and solar are not generators. They are gatherers. They are energy gatherers. It's like going fishing. You will get what the sea gives you. You cast out your net, you hope for the best. One thing we know about solar, sun goes down every single night, which is why we're so heavily trying to invest in batteries. But you'll never have the generation to move that. So we're moving solar across time from the middle of the day to the end of the day, which is when most people consume it. You can do that with batteries. You can't move it across weeks. So that becomes the big problem. If you were trying to run, as we are trying to run, our grid on wind, solar, and batteries, there will come times when it simply will not function, and you'll have to have something to back it up. So the thing that bothers me most about the direction of travel for Australia, particularly its east coast, is that we're building two systems. The one we advertise, wind, solar, and batteries, and the one that will be essential to back it up 100% when it's not working. That's the only way we can have any energy security, is to have a dispatchable source of power that sits behind the grid that's there when we need it.
Exactly. And we talk about batteries. I mean, for storage, we've got to generate the power in the first place to be able to store it, to be able to use it later.
Yeah, that's what I don't think people really understand. They keep talking about batteries as though they're a generation store. They're a storage source, right? So
Yeah.
I know I'm taking an all of the above approach. I've got a roof full of solar panels, and I've got two
Yep.
Tesla batteries in the garage. So think of me as a small Australia. This is where we want to go. And I can tell you, at the height of summer, that will pretty much cover my needs, as long as I don't run the air conditioning, by the way, because once you start doing that, then it does really draw down on those batteries very quickly. So, but
Yep.
what I need to do to fill the batteries is to create excess power. So I need every day to have enough power to run my home, and then the excess power to fill my batteries. Now, if it clouds over for even a day or two, what happens is the batteries don't fill during the day. And if during winter in Canberra, so we're talking for our winter, somewhere from April through to September, there's never enough energy to both fill the batteries and run the house. So I'm drawing from the grid.
Yep.
And that's the model that we're building. So where is the backup for that when all of Australia is running on that? And when you talk about the cost of batteries, it would cost you trillions of dollars to build the storage necessary to run Australia on what we're doing now, and forget it. If you want to do data centers and artificial intelligence, that churns through energy, and it
Yeah.
will not run on wind, solar, and batteries. No matter what they say, there will always be another energy source for when they say we're going to run on solar and batteries. Rubbish. Ask them the next question. And what else?
Yeah. And you mentioned that you have the batteries and solar. At the moment, in the climate that we're in, not everyone can afford that either. So, I mean,
Well,
it's it's great to have it, it'd be wonderful to have it, but when you can't afford it, you've got to rely on something else.
And again, you've put your finger on one of the real issues of all this. What we are seeing, and particularly under Labor governments, but let's face it, it's all governments, like, the coalition state governments were signed up to exactly the same program. So every government in Australia is involved in the greatest wealth transfer in Australia's history. Rich people like me with rooftops, so, I've got my own freestanding house, so I have the roof space to do it,
Yeah.
can get the rebates for solar and can get the rebates for batteries. If you're poor, you don't have that, and you have to stay connected to the grid. And the way that the system works by way of tariffs at the moment, because I imagine these things will all change as the penny drops, it is the kilowatt hour charge that I get charged covers a number of things. Some of it's the wholesale cost of electricity, some of it's the retail cost, but some of it's the transmission cost. And the less time that I spend on the grid drawing less electricity, the less I am paying for transmission. But Granny down the road, who's turning her power off because it's too expensive, she pays full freight. So she is paying for the transmission costs that we all need when we fall back on the grid. So there's a disproportionate sort of gift of her meagre wealth to me. And it's the same with electric vehicles. All of the subsidies that are going into place are being scooped up by rich people.
Yeah. Energy bills are an interesting one. I think it was last year you had a documentary and you broke down your energy bill and actually what you are paying for. And I personally, until that, had absolutely no idea what I was actually paying for.
Yeah, that's right. So when you look at the bill, it's broken up into a number of different parts. So the wholesale cost of electricity is one of those parts. That's, but then there's the retail part of the bill and there's the transmission distribution system. So the transmission and distribution system are set costs. So what happens is if you have to build more transmission, then the transmission company deals with the regulator and the regulator says, all right, well, this is what we reckon is a fair amount that you can charge. It's around about 40% of your bill. So if you're building massive amounts of new transmission lines, that gets added to your bill, locked in over 30 years. Now, what we've seen so far is the problems that we're having with the wholesale price of electricity, because no matter what the government says, when you apply a lot of wind and a lot of solar to the grid, you get huge volatility. Sure, the price is low. When it's generating, the price can actually drop below zero in the marketplace as it operates at the moment. But once it stops generating, the price spikes to the highest cost of generation. And by the way, we always pay electricity wholesale prices, always set at the highest cost of generation, not the lowest. So when everyone wants energy, at the end of the day, guess what? Sun's going down. And that's going to happen forever. So as solar drops off the grid, something has to step in to actually pick up the slack. Now, at the moment, the anchor on our prices is coal. Coal is still a really cheap source of energy. But as we lose each one of those coal-fired power plants, the spiking price is going to be to gas, which is more expensive. And it's really more expensive if it's only running every so often. And so the wholesale price has been marching up. But we're yet to see the full effects of the transmission costs, because we're going to have to roll out 6,000 kilometres worth of transmission lines, which all has to be paid for through your electricity bill. That price has to be recovered at a set rate of return over 30 years, because we're building these hugely dispersed kinds of power gathering through wind turbines spread across the entire landscape of Australia to try and recreate the generation that we already have.
Yeah.
So if you think about it, we're going to have to build 3 times the amount of generation capacity to get the actual generation which we're getting now. And people wonder why it is that we're becoming a less productive nation. The fuel source of the nation is being downgraded. So the speed limit of the nation is going down when we're doing this.
Yeah. I think if you ask the average punter if they would like an energy bill that is really expensive because we're trying to pay for all the transmission lines, for solar, for wind, et cetera, or an energy bill that's cheaper because we have coal-fired power stations, I think I know which they would choose.
Look, and the other thing too is we've got the equation completely wrong. So if you ask the wrong question, you will always get the wrong answer. So what should an electricity system do? It should deliver abundant, affordable energy to power your nation. Now, should it also cut carbon emissions? Yes, but that's a secondary thing. Now, what these governments, and I say all of them, have done over the course of the last 20 years is elevated cutting the carbon out of our generation above affordable, reliable power. So when you ask the wrong question, you will get the wrong answer. And we're seeing that at the moment. And we constantly get this bull dust modelling that comes out of all government agencies, including the CSIRO, which treats all power sources the same, does this thing called the levelised cost of power, and says the cheapest of all of these is wind and solar. Well, not when you attach it to a real-world electricity system, it isn't, because it has to then function with all of the other sources of power that actually do deliver energy when you want it. It turns out that around the world, this is the most expensive way to go about doing business. It's true in Germany, which has tried this. It's true in the UK, which has tried this. It's true in California, which has tried this. Which state in Australia has the most expensive electricity? South Australia. Which state in Australia has the most wind and solar reliant power system? South Australia. Which state in Australia has the flukiest energy system that constantly needs to be supported by other sources? South Australia. We don't need modelling. We're conducting a real world, real life model right now. And the proof of the pudding is the cost of your electricity bill and how reliable the system is. So it's becoming more expensive and less reliable.
Yeah, definitely. The Polly's selling everyone a bit of a lie when it comes to net zero.
Well, Jess, the best way to judge whether or not the world is serious about net zero is to look at its fuel sources and whether or not carbon emissions are falling. So last year, the world burned more coal, oil and gas than ever before in human history. Over the course of the last 20 years, we've dropped the amount of carbon, of fossil fuel energy, from about 85, 86% of all primary energy down to 81%. And carbon emissions have gone up every single year except for the global financial crisis and during COVID. So we know how to cut carbon emissions. That is to poleaxe your economy, and you'll find that carbon emissions fall because they are a signal of a recession. As I say, energy is where wealth comes from. Wealth is energy converted into work. That's where the money comes from. That's where our wealth comes from. So when you try to shut the energy sources down, you will make yourself poorer. And that's the pathway that Australia's on at the moment. And yes, our political class, our bureaucratic class, our academic class, the activist class, and the media class largely is all on board for a project which is making Australia poorer.
And I can't quite remember what it was in your presentation, but I'm sure you had an excerpt from a document that, from memory, was hundreds of pages long that basically said that it's not going to work.
Yeah, well, look, the thing is that what we're seeing now as the world is beginning to wake up to the fact that where the sources of power come from really seriously matter. And what matters most to countries now is not cutting carbon emissions, it's energy security. That is the word that you will hear around the world at the moment, particularly now. And Jess, we're getting a real live real life demonstration of what fuels matter at this very moment. Nobody is bombing wind turbines in the Gulf. So what's happened is we're seeing a global energy war. The people who know how the world really works, what are they doing? They are targeting energy sources. The nuclear option that the Iranian regime has at its disposal right now is cutting off the world's supply to 20% of its oil and gas. And what's the likely outcome? A global recession. This is the thing, too, that will force Donald Trump to retreat. If he cannot reopen the Straits of Hormuz, then the price of energy in the United States, despite the fact that they're an energy superpower, the gas price, the petrol price for Americans, is on the march upwards, and that applies enormous political pressure in the West. Australia is getting a lesson in the fact that we are at the arse end of a really long supply chain. We need the delivery of 2 supply ships every single day, bringing us refined fuels, because we import 90%, believe it or not, of our petrol, jet fuel and diesel. Diesel is the lifeblood of Australia. 91% of our primary energy comes from coal, oil and gas. 41% is liquid fuels. That is the biggest source of energy in Australia, and the biggest part of that is diesel. This is a widely dispersed, fairly population poor country. And we have a large population in some ways, but it's spread out over an enormous piece of land, and people keep talking to us about Norway. Well, you can fit 2 Norways inside New South Wales. Most of the goods in Australia travel by truck. Those trucks are driven by diesel. If that supply gets cut off, the supermarket shelves will empty, and we're already seeing the effects of this through price hikes and through shortages in regional Australia. If this continues for any length of time, we are going to get mugged by reality.
Yeah. The flow-on effects that I know that I've noticed in some conversations over the last couple of days when it comes to mining, I mean, and talking about what's happening in the Middle East, urea, ammonium nitrate, a couple of things that are essential for a mining operation, we could be seeing a lack of supply of that, which means coal production is going to slow down. I mean, there's just so
Absolutely.
many
Well,
flow-on effects.
and if the fuel sources are gone, then you can't drive anything anywhere.
Yeah,
We
that's
have not, again, people talking about, like, the thing that really gets me about this is there are, as typically, these daft conversations which are being having in cities. So if you've got an electric vehicle that you got a government subsidy for, you're feeling really smug now because you're not suffering the pain at the pump. And, if there is genuine shortages, you will still be able to drive your car around. Well, you'll be driving to supermarkets where there are empty shelves. So enjoy the experience, because you won't be filling up with anything, because the way that we get goods around the country will be choked by this. Now, let's hope that that does not happen. But we should always have been planning for that day to happen. And if you think that this is bad, imagine what will happen if China ever moves militarily against Taiwan. A large chunk of our fuel comes from South Korea. A large chunk of it comes from Singapore. It has to come through the South China Sea. What do you think is going to happen to those trade routes should there ever be a conflict between China and Taiwan? We won't have to be part of that war to be crippled by it. And the Chinese know that.
Yeah.
The Chinese know where our actual energy comes from, even if we choose to delude ourselves. So we should be planning for a severe interruption to our liquid fuels. We need to have that source here. Now, there isn't a whole lot of oil around left in Australia at the moment, but maybe we should be looking at things like coal to liquid fuels. That's a system that we know works now. It's hugely carbon intensive. It's something that China does. Why wouldn't Australia consider that, given the circumstances in which we find ourselves? Because energy is the economy, and energy security is national security. If we don't understand where our energy sources come from, then we are exposing ourselves to enormous economic and military danger.
What are your thoughts on nuclear? Should we be more seriously looking into that as an option in Australia? I mean, we can't mine it in New South Wales, which is frustrating.
Well, look, the thing is that we have, at the moment, of the known reserves that we have 1/3 of the world's uranium. But this is the equation this is the equation. So we export it, other people use it. It's like we export 7 times more coal than we burn. Now, if a ton of carbon produced anywhere is a problem everywhere, why don't we just burn more coal and have better power stations that are coal-fired, because that coal's getting burnt right now. Like, this is where the delusion comes in. We export uranium, we just don't use nuclear fuel. We're going to have nuclear submarines. So we actually believe that it's safe enough to get, a couple of hundred of the best and brightest men and women that we have in Australia and sink them in a cigar-shaped object under the ocean, attached to a nuclear fuel source. That is safe, apparently, but you can't have one for domestic consumption in Australia. Like, you could not make this stupidity up if you tried. The arguments the government run don't make any sense, because they're using nuclear fuel for defence. They're desperate to get it for defence. They won't use it for the defence of the homeland by powering electricity. Now, it is an expensive fuel source. There is no cheap option from where we are now. The cheapest option for Australia would be to build some new coal-fired power plants that are much cleaner than ones that we have now, and replace those at the same time. By the way, Jess, I'm not saying we shouldn't be looking to try and decarbonise. So we build better coal-fired power plants so that they are producing less carbon. We try to use carbon capture and storage wherever we can. That, again, it adds costs to things, but, there's no cheap way forward from here. So we use the fuel sources that we have at the moment to try and become as strong and as rich as we can. And then rich nations can do things about the environment. In the long term, we should be looking to look at large-scale nuclear and small-scale nuclear. And nuclear is going to be an option from the micro level all the way through to the macro level. So, US bases now are looking at by 2027, because they know that a cyber attack can take down their grid. They're looking at container-sized nuclear power plants to run very small scale. So we're talking about 5 megawatts, something like that. That would be perfect for a regional town in Australia. If they can get that technology working, why wouldn't we use that?
Exactly. What do you think is it that's fueling, the government to not want to go down this route, but to use it for other things, like you mentioned, as a fuel source for submarines?
Because they're involved in climate catastrophism. I mean, and I'm not saying, again, look, I've never made the argument that the climate isn't changing. Of course, the climate has changed throughout the course of human history. Most of our recorded history comes post an ice age. And how do we keep ourselves warm during an ice age? Well, we discovered how to use fire. We burned wood. We made heat. We actually managed to get around the world. We couldn't have done it, by the way, without a source of carbon fuel, and that was wood. What happened along the way is we got much better sources, much denser sources of power in coal, oil, and gas. So we used them. We didn't do that because we wanted to destroy the planet. We didn't do that willfully to commit harm to the planet. We did it because it made us really, really wealthy and improved people's lifestyles in a way that no one could have possibly contemplated in earlier generations. So that creates a problem. Everything's a trade-off. It produces carbon emissions. Now, that according to the best science, is having an effect on the world's climate. So we should try and reduce that footprint. But we're not going to do it by denying the way that we got to where we are and the fact that everything that you can see around you in the built environment has fossil fuel embedded in its industrial production. Concrete, steel, plastic, ammonia, all of them need fossil fuel for their manufacture. Everything that is delivered to you is delivered by fossil fuel. Your entire lifestyle is a measure of the amount of heat that you've been able to waste, whether you see it or not. So yes, we should try and do what we can to have the best and cleanest energy system that we can, but it will take time. What it's being driven by, of course, at the moment is the fact that government believes that the world is about to end, or is telling its people that it is. None of the science from the International Panel on Climate Change, which is the accumulation of all of this knowledge, says that we are facing Armageddon. We are facing perhaps a more difficult future, perhaps a warmer future. There is a lot of talk about extreme weather, but in fact, tropical cyclones in Australia, no matter what you're led to believe, the numbers of them have been falling. There is modelling saying that the intensity might increase, but we haven't measured that at the moment. So a lot of the things that people tell you about the sort of the way that the world is heading, and that the sense that everyone's got is that the world is coming to an end because of this, is simply false. So we shouldn't be stampeded. We shouldn't be panicked into a solution. We should be looking long term, staying rich, and using the source of energy that our country has.
Yeah, exactly. From what you've seen, is there a country that has this right, that has the mix right, that has energy security right?
Well, look, again, you can look at China as an example. Let's take China as an example, because it constantly gets thrown up at us because, we said it earlier. It's got more wind, it's got more solar, it's got more batteries than any other nation on Earth. And that is absolutely true, because it's got more of everything than any other nation on Earth, because it's got 1 billion people, it's got a massive economy, and it's centrally driven. And the people there making choices about energy are making very wise ones. What were they doing in the last couple of years? They were building 2 coal-fired power plants a week. A week. As you said, 58% of the world's coal is now burned by China. What does it do? It makes wind turbines, it makes solar panels, it makes batteries out of all that. It sells them to us and tells us, you should run your entire economy on that. This would be a great idea. That's not what they're doing.
Exactly.
So what they're doing is they're doing all of the above. And by the way, they have done enormous environmental damage. They have got more hydro than anyone else on Earth, because they've dammed so many rivers and caused so much environmental damage to do it. So they have hydro as well. And by the way, they're building 150 nuclear power plants. So what should we do? We should do what China's doing, not just take the spin that the government gives us off the top on wind, solar and batteries, but look at everything they're doing and do that.
Yeah, exactly. Lastly, Chris, where do you see us in 5 years?
I'm really deeply concerned, Jess. I genuinely think that we have now a clown show of governments around Australia. Some are better than others. I actually think that the South Australian government under Peter Malinauskas is good. New South Wales is good. Victoria is a basket case. Queensland, obviously, under the LNP, we're watching and seeing what they do, and I'm watching what they do rather than what they say, and I think they're making some good choices on energy. The federal government under Chris Bowen, of course, continues to essentially give us just a spin cycle. The government's actually said that the price of electricity was going down. it was, because they spent $6.8 billion in subsidies to try and mask the pain for consumers because the price of electricity was going up so much. Those subsidies have come off now. My concern is that we will get entirely the wrong lesson out of what's going on in the world at the moment. What we should be doing now is trying to get our liquid fuel supplies up onshore, that we have our own sources of the fuels that we need so much, that we can't do it in a rapid way. We should be moving towards that. But Chris Bowen's giving speeches right now saying that the way to be energy secure is to trust your future to the wind and the sunshine and batteries, that the answer that we should have out of this crisis is that energy security comes from the weather. And again, I always find this amusing, is the people who are telling us that the weather is going to change have now hitched their wagon to a weather future that they can't possibly predict. So it is, if that is the answer that this government comes up with for Australia's future, what we're going to see is that a once wealthy nation will become increasingly poorer. And of course, we're living off the fumes of all the wealth that we accumulated over decades. We're still, of course, biggest exports, coal, iron ore, liquefied natural gas, so all of these things hugely energy intensive. The government wants to get rid of all those as well. That's part of the plan, is that we'll get rid of those energy sources and somehow become a green energy superpower. So I think it's like what, as Hemingway said in one of his novels, how did you become bankrupt? And the guy said, well, slowly at first and then really fast. We're in the slow part at the moment. Then one day it will be really fast as we discover that you can't run an economy on just selling high-priced houses and coffee to each other.
Exactly. Chris, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
No worries, Jess. Take care.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of Digging Deeper with At The Coalface. You can download more episodes of the podcast on all your favourite podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, also on YouTube, Amazon Music, all the usual places. Make sure you leave us a rating and a review. We'd love to hear what you thought. And if you do have a story idea or something you'd like us to talk about on the podcast, please send me an email, jess@thecoalface.net.au. I'd love to hear from you. And we'll be back next time for another episode of Digging Deeper with At The Coalface.